Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we flee to the wilderness, hoping solitude will heal what people couldn't. For 3 years, Jonah Gage had done exactly that, living alone in the Montana mountains after losing everything that mattered. His days were a simple hunt, survive, and try to forget the past that haunted his dreams. But when a massive black panther began following him through the forest, his quiet world changed forever. The creature didn't hunt him or show aggression. It just watched with golden eyes and trailed behind him day after day. No matter how far Jonah traveled or how hard he tried to lose it, the panther kept coming back. What could make such a powerful, wild animal abandon everything to follow one lonely man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat nestled against a granite outcropping, its weathered logs blending seamlessly with the towering pines that surrounded it like ancient sentinels. Jonah Gage had built it with his own hands 3 winters ago, each notch cut with the precision of a man who had nothing but time and an abundance of regret to work through. The structure was simple, but solid, one room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun as it crested the eastern peaks. On this particular morning, frost painted delicate patterns across the glass, and Jonah's breath misted in the cold air as he stepped onto the covered porch. His ritual was always the same. Check the weather, scan the tree line for a game sign, and listen to the forest's morning symphony. But for the past week, something had changed. Something watched him from the shadows between the pines. Jonah pulled his worn leather journal from his coat pocket and flipped to the latest entry. His handwriting, once neat and controlled during his years as a school principal, had grown loose and sprawling during his time in the wilderness. The page contained rough sketches of paw prints, massive ones, larger than any mountain lion he'd ever tracked. Below the drawings, he'd written a single word in capital letters: Panther. The animal had first appeared 7 days ago. A fleeting shadow glimpsed from the corner of his eye while he checked his trap lines. At first, Jonah had dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks. The mind could conjure all sorts of phantoms when a man spent too much time alone with his thoughts. But the sightings had continued, growing bolder each day. Yesterday, the creature had stood in plain view at the forest's edge, golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jonah closed the journal and slipped it back into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small velvet pouch he always carried there. Inside that pouch lay Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had meant everything to her and now weighed heavier than lead in his pocket. He'd carried it for 3 years, unable to wear it, unable to put it away. Sarah Catherine Mills had become Sarah Catherine Gage on a crisp October afternoon 22 years ago. She'd worn her grandmother's dress, carried wildflowers instead of expensive roses, and promised to love him through whatever storms life might bring. They'd kept that promise through 15 years of marriage, through the joy of Emma's birth, through the lean years when his teacher's salary barely covered their needs, through Sarah's battle with depression after her second miscarriage. But promises, Jonah had learned, couldn't survive fire. He forced himself to turn away from that familiar spiral of memory and focus on the present. The panther was real, not some grief-induced hallucination. The tracks in the mud near his water source proved that. 4 inches across, with claw marks extending well beyond the pads, this was a predator built for killing. Yet it hadn't attacked, hadn't even threatened. It simply watched and followed, like a shadow with golden eyes. Jonah stepped off the porch and walked to his woodshed, noting fresh scratches on the bark of a nearby pine. The marks were 8 feet off the ground higher than any mountain lion could reach. This cat was massive, probably weighing close to 200 pounds. In the old days, before the cattle ranchers and bounty hunters had nearly wiped them out, black panthers had roamed these mountains. Most folks claimed they were extinct in Montana, but the wilderness had ways of hiding its secrets. As he loaded split pine logs into his canvas carrier, Jonah felt the familiar weight of being observed. He straightened slowly and scanned the forest, his eyes trained by years of hunting to catch the slightest movement. There, between two massive Douglas firs, a patch of shadow that seemed too dense, too deliberate. The panther stood motionless, her sleek form barely visible against the dark bark. Their eyes met across 40 yards of mountain meadow, and Jonah felt something shift in his chest. The animal's gaze held none of the predatory hunger he expected. Instead, there was something almost human in those golden depths, a desperate intelligence that made his breath catch in his throat. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, the words swallowed by the morning stillness. The panther tilted her head slightly, as if she'd heard him, as if she were trying to find a way to answer. Then, with fluid grace that belonged to another world, she melted back into the forest, leaving only the whisper of disturbed branches in her wake. Jonah stood frozen for several heartbeats, the canvas carrier forgotten in his hands, in all his years in the wilderness, first as a weekend hunter, then as a man fleeing from unbearable loss. He'd never encountered anything like this. Wild animals were predictable. They hunted, mated, raised their young, and died according to nature's ancient rhythms. They didn't follow humans with something approaching hope in their eyes. He forced himself to return to his morning routine, carrying the firewood inside and banking the coals in his stone hearth. But as he prepared his simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits, his mind kept returning to that moment of connection. The panther had been trying to communicate something. He was certain of it. The question was whether he possessed the wisdom to understand what she needed. The cabin felt smaller than usual as he ate his meal, the silence more oppressive. For 3 years, solitude had been his closest companion, a buffer between himself and a world that had taken everything he loved. He'd built his life around routine and emptiness, finding a strange comfort in the predictability of his days. Dawn brought coffee and the checking of trap lines. Noon brought simple meals and repairs to his equipment. Evening brought whiskey and the leather journal where he sketched the mountains and recorded his observations of wildlife behavior. But the panther's arrival had disrupted that carefully constructed peace. She represented something he'd tried to bury along with Sarah and Emma, the possibility of connection, of caring about another living being's fate. The thought terrified him more than any predator ever could. After breakfast, Jonah strapped on his hunting knife and shouldered his rifle. His trap lines needed checking, and he'd grown low on fresh meat. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine sap and the distant promise of snow. As he walked the familiar game trails, he found himself moving with extra caution, hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The panther appeared twice more during his morning rounds, always at a distance, always watching. She showed no interest in the rabbits he collected from his snares or the deer sign he noted for future hunting. Her attention remained fixed solely on him, and that focused intensity began to wear on his nerves like water dripping on stone. By the time Jonah returned to his cabin, the sun had reached its zenith, and his shoulders ached from the constant tension of being observed. He cleaned his catch on the wooden table behind his cabin, the familiar ritual of skinning and butchering, providing a temporary distraction from the golden eyes that watched from the forest's edge. As afternoon faded, toward evening, Jonah found himself drawn to the wooden box he kept beneath his bed. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the few possessions he'd salvaged from his old life. Sarah's favorite book of poetry, its spine cracked from countless readings. Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit, still smelling faintly of the lavender soak Sarah had used. And beneath it all, a single photograph, the last one taken of his family, just 2 weeks before the fire. They'd been camping at Glacier National Park, Emma's first real wilderness adventure at age 8. Sarah sat on a fallen log beside the lake, her auburn hair catching the golden light of sunset. Emma perched on her lap, gap-toothed grin bright with excitement over the fish they'd caught that morning. And there was Jonah beside them, his arm around his wife's shoulders, looking happier than any man had a right to be. He'd been teaching Emma to cast when the park ranger found them. A neighbor had called about smoke visible from their house. By the time Jonah drove the 3 hours home, the fire department had contained the blaze, but it was too late. Faulty wiring in the basement, they'd said. Sarah and Emma had died in their sleep from smoke inhalation, probably never knowing what was happening. The photograph trembled in Jonah's weathered hands as he studied those beloved faces. Emma would be 11 now if she'd lived, probably more interested in boys than fishing trips with her old man. Sarah would be 41, still beautiful, still filling their home with laughter and the smell of fresh-baked bread. But the fire had taken them, and guilt had driven him here to the mountains where no one expected anything from him, where his failures couldn't hurt anyone else. He'd been absent when his family needed him most, off indulging his love of the wilderness while they died alone in their beds. The weight of that knowledge had proved too heavy to carry in the world of other people, with their sympathy and their gentle suggestions that he needed to move on and heal. The mountains asked nothing of him except survival, and that was a challenge he could meet. Day after day, season after season, he'd proven he could endure. But endurance wasn't the same as living, and somewhere deep in his heart, Jonah knew the difference. As darkness settled over the forest like a familiar blanket, he lit his oil lamp and opened the leather journal to a fresh page. His pencil moved across the paper with practiced strokes, sketching the Panther as he remembered her elegant, powerful, and filled with something that looked remarkably like longing. Outside, something moved in the darkness beyond his windows. Not the scurrying of small creatures or the rustling of wind through pine boughs, but the deliberate patting of large paws across dead leaves. The Panther had returned, drawn by lamplight or instinct or some need Jonah couldn't begin to fathom. He set down his pencil and walked to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. In the pale moonlight, he could just make out her silhouette near the tree line, a darker shadow among the shadows, patient as stone and twice as enduring. "What do you want?" he whispered again, his breath fogging the window. The Panther turned her head toward the cabin, and for a moment, Jonah could have sworn he saw starlight reflected in her eyes. Then she settled onto her haunches like a great cat prepared to wait forever, and Jonah understood with sudden clarity that his life of careful isolation was about to change, whether he wanted it to or not. The third Tuesday of every month, Jonah made the same pilgrimage. It required a 4-mile hike down treacherous mountain paths to reach the small cemetery that served the scattered communities of Pine Ridge Valley. Most folks drove the winding dirt road that connected to the state highway, but Jonah preferred the isolation of the mountain trails. The walk gave him time to prepare for what always proved to be the most difficult hours of his month. Sarah Catherine Gage and Emma Rose Gage lay side by side beneath matching granite headstones, their graves marked by the wooden cross Jonah had carved during his first winter in the mountains. The cross bore no religious inscription. Sarah had lost her faith long before the fire claimed her life, and Jonah had never found his to begin with. Instead, he'd carved their names and a simple message: beloved wife and daughter, forever in our hearts. The cemetery keeper, old Miguel Santos, maintained the graves with respectful care, keeping the grass trimmed and the weeds pulled. Jonah always left an envelope with $50 tucked beneath a stone on Miguel's workbench in the maintenance shed. They'd never spoken about the arrangement, but the graves were always perfect when Jonah arrived for his monthly visits. This October morning carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and frost clung to the granite like tears that had frozen before they could fall. Jonah knelt between the graves and placed his weathered hands on the cold stone, feeling the carved letters beneath his palms. Sarah's headstone bore the dates 1984 to 2021, a span of 37 years that seemed impossibly brief. Emma's dates heard worse. 2013 to 2021. 8 years old when the fire took her. 8 years of bright laughter and endless questions and bedtime stories cut short by faulty wiring and his own absence. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words forming clouds. In the cold air, "I'm so damn sorry I wasn't there." The familiar weight of guilt settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd spoken these same words every month for 3 years, and they never grew easier to say. If he'd been home that night instead of camping alone in the Bitterroot Mountains, checking his favorite elk hunting spots before the season opened, he might have smelled the smoke, might have woken them up, might have saved them. Instead, he'd been 60 miles away, sleeping peacefully under stars while his family died. Jonah pulled weeds that weren't there and straightened flowers that didn't need adjusting, busying his hands while his heart cracked open again. He told them about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he built and the wildlife he observed. He spoke of the books he was reading. Sarah had always encouraged his love of literature and the sketches he drew in his journal. But he didn't mention the drinking that had nearly killed him during his first winter alone, or the nights when he stood at the cliff's edge behind his cabin and wondered if the pain would ever stop. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush made him look up from the graves. 50 yards away, at the forest's edge where the cemetery met the wild land beyond, the panther stood watching him. Her black coat seemed to absorb the morning light, making her appear more like a shadow given form than a living creature. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. In all his monthly visits, no wild animal had ever ventured this close to the cemetery. The panther's presence here felt almost supernatural, as if the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had grown thin enough for spirits to cross. "Go away," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb the sacred silence of this place. "This isn't for you." But the panther didn't retreat. Instead, she took several steps closer, moving with the fluid grace that marked all great predators. Her golden eyes fixed on Jonah with that same intense intelligence he'd noted before. But now there seemed to be something else in her gaze, something that looked remarkably like sympathy. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The panther wasn't here to hunt or threaten. She was here because she sensed his grief, drawn by some instinct that recognized pain and loss. Animals possess senses far beyond human understanding, and perhaps this magnificent creature could smell the sorrow that clung to him like smoke. "You don't understand," Jonah said, his voice breaking on the words. "I failed them. I wasn't there when they needed me most." The panther tilted her head, stunning him with those impossibly expressive eyes. Then she did something that shattered what remained of Jonah's composure. She lay down at the forest's edge, settling her massive frame against the earth as if she intended to wait with him in his vigil. The tears came then, hot and bitter, as they carved tracks down his weathered cheeks. 3 years of carefully controlled grief poured out of him in great gasping sobs that echoed off the granite headstones. He wept for Sarah's smile and Emma's laughter, for birthday parties he'd never attend and grandchildren he'd never hold. He wept for the life that should have been and the man he'd become, instead broken, isolated, more dead than alive. Through the storm of his grief, Jonah became aware that the panther had risen and moved closer. When he finally lifted his head, she stood barely 20 feet away, her massive form radiating a presence that was both wild and oddly comforting. Her eyes held depths of understanding that seemed impossible in an animal, as if she too had known loss and recognized it in another. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Jonah whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. The panther took another step closer, close enough now that he could see the individual whiskers on her muzzle, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She was magnificent, easily 6 feet. from nose to tail, with the lean muscle mass of a predator in her prime. But there was something else about her, something that spoke of exhaustion and desperation barely held in check. As Jonas studied her more closely, he noticed what he'd missed. Before, the panther favored her left hind leg slightly, and her coat, while beautiful, had the slightly unkempt look of an animal under stress. Dark smudges beneath her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and her ribs were more prominent than they should be on a well-fed predator. She was hurting, Jonah realized. Whatever had driven her to follow him through the wilderness, it came from a place of need rather than mere curiosity. The thought stirred something in his chest that he thought dead and buried. The instinct to help, to heal, to protect the vulnerable. It was the same impulse that had made him a good teacher, a loving husband, a devoted father. But opening his heart to this creature meant risking the pain of caring again, and Jonah wasn't sure he possessed the courage for that kind of vulnerability. "I can't," he said aloud, though whether he was speaking to the panther or to the memory of his family, he couldn't say. "I can't go through that again." The panther watched him for a long moment, her golden eyes seeming to peer directly into his soul. Then she turned and padded back toward the forest, pausing once to look over her shoulder before disappearing into the trees. Jonah remained kneeling between the graves for another hour, his mind churning with questions he couldn't answer. When he finally rose to leave, his legs were stiff from the cold and his heart felt raw as an open wound. But something had changed during those moments of connection with the panther. Some small crack in the wall he'd built around his emotions. Walk back to his cabin passed in a blur of autumn colors and scattered thoughts. By the time he reached his porch, the sun had reached its zenith, and exhaustion weighed on him like a physical burden. The emotional release at the cemetery had drained him more thoroughly than any physical labor ever could. But as he climbed the steps to his front door, Jonah noticed something that made him pause. Scratched into the wooden porch rail were fresh claw marks, 4 parallel grooves carved deep into the pine. The panther had been here while he was gone, marking his home with the deliberate precision of an animal claiming territory. Only this didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a message. That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, Jonah sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and his leather journal. He sketched the panther as he remembered her from the cemetery, alert, intelligent, and bearing some burden that he couldn't yet understand. As his pencil moved across the paper, he found himself adding details that spoke to her hidden pain. The slight droop of her shoulders, the way she held her injured leg, the desperate hope that flickered in her golden eyes. A sound in the darkness made him look up from his drawing. The panther stood at the edge of his lamplight, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he'd had the courage. She studied him for a long moment, then deliberately walked to the wooden cross he'd propped against his cabin. All the same cross he'd carved for his family's grave. Its twin resting in the cemetery below. The panther sniffed the cross carefully, then looked back at Jonah with an expression that seemed to hold infinite sadness. In that moment, he understood that whatever had brought this magnificent creature into his life, it was connected to loss and love and the desperate hope that somehow, someday, the broken pieces of a shattered heart might heal. The realization terrified him more than any predator ever could. But as the panther melted back into the darkness, Jonah found himself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, healing was exactly what they both needed. The old tracking manual had belonged to Jonah's father, its pages yellowed with age and margin. Notes written in careful script. Understanding Wildlife Behavior, a guide for hunters and naturalists by Robert Elwood, sat on Jonah's kitchen table, open to a chapter titled Interpreting Animal Communication. He'd found the book buried in the trunk of his father's belongings, items he'd kept but never examined until now. Jonah traced his finger along a passage his father had underlined decades ago. Large predators rarely alter their natural behavior without significant cause. When a solitary hunter begins following humans, it typically indicates injury, territorial displacement, or protection of young. Protection of young. The words resonated in Jonah's mind as he recalled the panther's behavior over the past week. Her deliberate movements, the way she always positioned herself between him and certain areas of the forest. Her obvious exhaustion all pointed to an animal with responsibilities beyond her own survival. The morning after his breakdown at the cemetery, Jonah had awakened with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Instead of checking his trap lines or splitting firewood, he'd spent the day observing the panther's patterns from his cabin windows. She appeared predictably at dawn and dusk, always maintaining a distance of 30 to 40 yards, always watching, with those intelligent golden eyes. But it was her movements between appearances that intrigued him most. Through his binoculars, Jonah had tracked her path as she disappeared into the dense forest to the north, following game trails that led deeper into the wilderness than he'd ever ventured. She moved with purpose, not the random wandering of a hunting predator, but the directed travel of an animal with a specific destination. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Lessons learned during childhood hunting trips in these same mountains. Animals tell stories, son. You just have to learn their language. Watch their ears, their tail position, the way they move their head. Every gesture has meaning. Thomas Gage had been a man of few words but infinite patience, a teacher who believed in showing rather than telling. He'd spent countless hours with young Jonah in the wilderness, passing down knowledge gained through a lifetime of respectful hunting and wildlife observation. The tracking manual represented years of accumulated wisdom, field notes from a man who understood that successful hunting required understanding the prey as more than just a target. Jonah turned to another marked page, this one dealing with injured animals. His father had written extensive notes in the margins about a wounded elk they'd tracked for 3 days. Observations about how injury affected behavior patterns. Herd animals make different choices, read one note. Desperation changes everything. The panther was desperate. Jonah was certain of that now. Her willingness to approach human habitation, her persistence despite his attempts to discourage her. These weren't the actions of a healthy predator operating within normal parameters. Something had driven her beyond the boundaries of typical behavior, some need so pressing that it overcame her natural wariness thought as the sun reached its zenith. Jonah made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He would follow her, not aggressively, not as a hunter pursuing prey, but as a student trying to understand his teacher. The panther had something to show him, some truth she was trying to communicate through her persistence. His father had taught him that wisdom often came from unexpected sources, and perhaps this magnificent creature carried knowledge he needed to learn. Jonah gathered his tracking gear with the methodical care his father had instilled in him. Canvas day pack with emergency supplies, water purification tablets, basic first aid kit, compass, and a small folding knife that had belonged to 3 generations of Gage men. He left his rifle behind. This wasn't a hunting expedition, and the weapon's presence might be seen as a threat. The tracking began at the spot where he'd last seen the panther disappear into the forest. Her prints were clearly visible in the soft earth near his water source, 4-inch pads with claw marks extending well beyond the toes. Jonah knelt beside the clearest track and spread his hand next to it for scale. The panther's paw was nearly twice the width of his palm, confirmation of the animal's impressive size. Following the trail required all the skills his father had taught him during those long-ago hunting trips. The panther moved like a ghost through the forest, her paws finding solid ground that left minimal sign. But Jonah had learned to read the subtle language of disturbed leaves, bent grass, and the faint impressions left in patches of soft soil. The trail led steadily upward through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. Ancient Douglas firs gave way to pine and aspen as elevation increased, and granite outcroppings forced frequent detours around impassable barriers. The panther's route showed intimate knowledge of the landscape, taking advantage of natural corridors and game trails that offered the easiest passage through difficult country. 2 hours into the tracking, Jonah paused beside a lightning-struck pine to examine fresh sign. The panther had stopped here recently, her claws leaving deep gouges in the bark 8 feet above the ground. But these weren't territorial markings. They were stress signs, the kind of damage an agitated animal inflicted when emotional pressure exceeded control. His father's manual contained a detailed section on stress indicators in large predators. Excessive marking, restless behavior, and vocal displays often indicate an animal under severe psychological pressure. Mothers separated from young exhibit the most extreme versions of these behaviors. Mothers separated from young. The phrase sent a chill down Jonah's spine as pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place. The panther's desperation, her willingness to approach humans, her obvious exhaustion, all pointed to a mother in crisis. As if summoned by his thoughts, the panther materialized from the shadows ahead. She stood on a fallen log that crossed a small creek, her body silhouetted against the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. For a moment, neither moved. Predator and human locked in a contest of wills that would determine whether trust or fear prevailed. The panther's ears swiveled forward in an expression Jonah recognized from his father's teachings. Alert attention without aggressive intent. Her tail hung low but not tucked, another sign of wariness rather than hostility. Most importantly, her eyes held that same desperate intelligence he'd noted before, as if she were trying to communicate something vitally important. "Easy, girl," Jonah said softly, using the same tone he'd once employed to calm frightened students on their first camping trips. "I'm trying to understand." The panther's head tilted at the sound of his voice, and Jonah caught something he'd missed before, a barely perceptible tremor in her powerful frame. She was exhausted, running on reserves that couldn't last much longer. Whatever crisis had driven her to seek human help was reaching a critical point. Slowly, deliberately, the panther turned and began walking along the fallen log. She paused twice to look back at Jonah, her message unmistakable. "Follow me." The gesture was so human-like, so clearly purposeful, that Jonah felt his breath catch in his throat. Wild animals didn't guide humans through the forest. They didn't communicate with such obvious intelligence. Yet here was a creature of supreme power and grace begging for his help with the eloquence of necessity. His father had always said that the wilderness held mysteries beyond human understanding. But Jonah had never expected to encounter one so directly. As he followed the panther deeper into the mountains, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought dead forever, the desire to help, to heal, to make a difference in another being's life. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, following ridgelines and creek beds that showed no sign of human passage. This was wilderness in its purest form, unchanged since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. The panther moved through it with the confidence of long familiarity, leading Jonah towards some destination that grew more important with each passing hour. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the panther stopped beside a massive boulder and looked back at Jonah with unmistakable urgency. Her message was clear: time was running out. Whatever she needed to show him lay just ahead, and the window of opportunity was closing fast. Jonah checked his compass and noted their position on the mental map he'd been building throughout the day's journey. They traveled nearly 5 miles from his cabin, moving steadily northeast toward the heart of the wilderness preserve. Few humans had ever set foot in this remote country, making it perfect habitat for a creature that preferred to remain hidden from the world. The realization that he was being led into the panther's secret domain filled Jonah with equal measures of anticipation and apprehension. Whatever lay ahead would change everything. He was certain of that. The question was whether he possessed the courage to face what the panther was so desperate to show him. The hand-carved flute had been Jonah's winter project during his second year in the mountains, fashioned from a piece of mountain maple he'd found after a spring storm. Its simple design bore the imperfections of an amateur craftsman, but it produced clear, sweet notes that seemed to blend naturally with the forest symphony. Tonight, as he sat on his cabin porch waiting for the panther's return, the instrument felt warm and familiar in his weathered hands. The day's tracking expedition had ended in frustration. After leading him 5 miles into the wilderness, the panther had simply vanished, dissolving into the forest like smoke. Jonah had searched for another hour before admitting defeat and beginning the long trek home. But the experience had confirmed his growing suspicions. The panther was trying to show him something specific, something that lay beyond the boundaries of his current understanding. Now, as sunset painted the western peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Jonah lifted the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody that emerged was one Sarah had hummed while working in their garden, a half-remembered tune from her childhood that spoke of simpler times and innocent joy. He'd never learned its name, but the notes had etched themselves into his memory during those precious years when music and laughter had filled their home. The sound drifted across the clearing and into the darkening forest, carried by the evening breeze like an invitation to whatever creatures might be listening. Jonah had discovered that music possessed a strange power in the wilderness. It seemed to calm the wild things, to bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness in ways that words never could. A soft rustling in the underbrush announced the panther's arrival. She emerged from the tree line with her characteristic fluid grace, but tonight something was different. Instead of maintaining her usual distance, she approached to within 15 feet of the porch before settling onto her haunches. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Jonah's face as he continued to play, and he could have sworn he saw something like appreciation in their depths. When the melody ended, the silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility. The panther remained motionless, her massive form outlined against the star-filled sky, waiting for something that neither of them could quite name. "Sarah used to sing that song," Jonah said softly, setting the flute aside. "She had the most beautiful voice you ever heard. Could make even the saddest songs sound like hope." The panther's ears swiveled forward at the sound of his voice, and Jonah found himself continuing, drawn by the strange comfort of having something to talk to after years of silence. She loved all kinds of music, but especially the old songs her grandmother taught her. Folk songs and hymns and lullabies passed down through generations of mountain women. She said music was how people stayed connected to their roots, to the things that mattered most. As he spoke, memories surfaced, unbidden Sarah singing to baby Emma during those late-night feedings, her voice soft and low in the darkened nursery. Emma learning to clap along to simple melodies, her chubby hands never quite keeping time, but her joy infectious enough to fill the house with laughter. Sunday morning pancake breakfasts accompanied by Sarah's gentle humming. The sound as much a part of their weekly ritual as the smell of bacon and maple syrup. The panther inched closer, drawn by something in Jonah's voice, or perhaps by the emotions that colored his words. She moved with exquisite care, each step deliberate and non-threatening, until she lay down at the base of the porch steps. Her presence felt oddly comforting, like a large dog settling in for the evening. "You're a good listener," Jonah murmured, surprised by how natural it felt to share his thoughts with this magnificent creature, better than most humans I've known. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a piece of jerky, tearing off a small portion and tossing it gently in the panther's direction. She sniffed the offering carefully before picking it up with delicate precision, her powerful jaws handling the morsel as if it were made of glass. The simple act of feeding her felt like crossing a bridge between their two worlds. For the first time since the panther had appeared in his life, Jonah allowed himself to truly study her without the filter of fear or confusion. She was breathtaking in her wild beauty. Every line of her body spoke of power and grace refined by millions of years of evolution. But beneath that predatory perfection, he could see the signs of stress he'd noted before. The slight prominence of her ribs, the weariness that seemed to settle on her like dust. "You're not eating enough," he observed, tossing another piece of jerky. "A cat your size should be hunting every few days, bringing down deer or elk. But you're spending too much time watching me instead of taking care of yourself." The panther's response was to fix him with a stare of such intensity that Jonah felt his breath catch. There was accusation in those golden eyes, as if she were saying that he, of all people, should understand the cost of neglecting oneself in service of a higher purpose. The thought struck him like a physical blow. How long had it been since he'd eaten a proper meal instead of subsisting on coffee and whatever came easily to hand? When had he last looked at himself in a mirror instead of avoiding his own reflection? The panther wasn't the only one running on empty reserves. "Point taken," he said quietly, earning what might have been approval in the tilt of her massive head as the night deepened around them. Jonah found himself sharing more of his story. He told the panther about his years as a teacher, about the satisfaction he'd found in helping young minds discover their potential. He spoke of his courtship with Sarah, their wedding, the joy of Emma's birth, and the quiet happiness they'd built together in their small mountain town. The panther listened with an attention that seemed almost human, her golden eyes never leaving his face. Occasionally, she would shift position or cock her head at a particular inflection in his voice, but she never broke the spell of connection that had settled between them. When Jonah reached the part of his story that dealt with the fire and its aftermath, his voice broke and the words came harder. The panther seemed to sense his distress, rising from her position at the base of the steps and moving closer until she lay directly in front of the porch. Her presence offered silent comfort, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in his grief. "I should have been there," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "If I hadn't been so selfish, so focused on my own needs, they might still be alive." The panther's response was to place one massive paw on the bottom step of the porch, stretching her body until her golden eyes were level with his. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, a reaching across the species barrier that spoke of understanding and shared pain. In that moment, Jonah saw his own grief reflected in the panther's gaze, and understanding dawned with startling clarity. This magnificent creature knew loss as intimately as he did. Whatever had driven her to seek his help was rooted in the same desperate love that had sent him fleeing to the mountains. "You've lost someone too," he said, and the panther's eyes seemed to confirm his words. "That's what this is about, isn't it? You need help saving someone you love." The admission hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared understanding that transformed stranger into ally. For the first time in 3 years, Jonah felt the stirring of purpose beyond mere survival. This creature needed him, trusted him enough to reveal her vulnerability, and perhaps in helping her, he might find a way to forgive himself for the times he'd failed to be there when it mattered most. The panther held his gaze for a long moment, then rose gracefully to her feet. She looked toward the forest, then back at Jonah, her message clear as spoken words. Tomorrow, she would show him what she'd been trying to reveal. Tomorrow, he would learn why a creature of the wild had chosen to place her faith in a broken man who'd forgotten how to hope. As she melted back into the darkness, Jonah remained on his porch, the flute forgotten in his hands. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between them, a recognition of kindred spirits bound by loss and the desperate hope that love might still find a way to heal the wounds that seemed too deep for time to touch. The military compass had guided Thomas Gage through the jungles of Vietnam and later, through countless hunting expeditions in the Montana wilderness. Its brass case bore the scratches and dents of hard use, but the needle still pointed true north, with unwavering accuracy. Now it rested in Jonah's palm as he prepared to follow the Panther deeper into territory that had never appeared on any map. Dawn had arrived gray and cold, with low clouds pressing against the mountain peaks like a wool blanket. The Panther appeared at first light, materializing from the forest with the same ethereal grace that marked all her movements. But today, urgency radiated from her powerful frame like heat from a forge. She paced restlessly at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes fixed on Jonah with unmistakable impatience. "I'm coming," he called softly, shouldering his pack and checking his equipment one final time. Along with his father's compass, he carried emergency supplies for an extended trek: water purification tablets, high-energy food bars, a basic medical kit, rope, and the folding knife that had served 3 generations of gauge men. Most importantly, he'd brought his cell phone, though he doubted it would find signal in the deep wilderness where the Panther was leading him. The journey began where yesterday's tracking had ended, at the massive boulder where the Panther had vanished like smoke. Today, she made no attempt at concealment, padding openly along game trails that wound ever deeper into the mountain's heart. Her pace was relentless but not reckless, designed to cover maximum distance while conserving energy. For whatever lay ahead, the terrain grew increasingly challenging as they climbed higher into the alpine zone. Ancient Douglas firs gave way to pine and spruce, their branches heavy with decades of accumulated snow and storm damage. Granite cliffs rose on both sides of narrow valleys, creating natural corridors that funneled wind and weather into concentrated channels of force. Jonah's military training, from his brief stint in the National Guard, served him well as they navigated treacherous passages where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. The Panther moved through these hazards with the confidence of long familiarity, but she frequently paused to ensure he was following safely. Her concern for his welfare spoke to an intelligence that went far beyond mere animal instinct. 3 hours into the journey, they reached a section where a recent rock slide had obliterated the trail. Boulders the size of automobiles lay scattered across the narrow valley floor, creating a maze of obstacles that would challenge even an experienced mountaineer. The Panther studied the terrain for several minutes before choosing a route that took advantage of natural ledges and stable footing. As they picked their way through the debris field, Jonah became aware that this wasn't random destruction. The rock slide showed clear signs of human interference: blast marks on the cliff face, steel cable fragments buried in the rubble, and the too perfect alignment of fallen stones. Someone had deliberately triggered this slide, probably to block access to whatever lay beyond. The realization sent a chill through him. That had nothing to do with the mountain air. In his years as a teacher and school administrator, he dealt with enough human cruelty to recognize its signs. Someone had wanted to seal off this section of wilderness, and they'd been willing to destroy a pristine ecosystem to accomplish their goal. The Panther's behavior as they navigated the slide zone confirmed his suspicions. Her ears remained constantly in motion, scanning for sounds that didn't belong in the natural environment. Her nostrils flared repeatedly, testing air currents for scents that might indicate danger. This was an animal operating in hostile territory, aware that threats existed beyond the normal predators and hazards of mountain life. Beyond the rock slide, the valley opened into a hidden basin that took Jonah's breath away. Steep granite walls rose on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater that protected the enclosed meadow from the worst mountain weather. A crystal-clear stream meandered through the center of the space, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Wildflowers dotted the grassland despite the late season, protected by the basin's unique microclimate. But it was the trees that captured Jonah's attention and held it with reverent awe. Ancient pines, some clearly predating European settlement of the region, stood like cathedral pillars around the meadow's perimeter. Their massive trunks bore scars that spoke of centuries weathering lightning strikes, blizzards, and forest fires. These were the survivors, the witnesses to history that stretched back to a time when only native peoples had walked these mountains. Carved into the bark of the largest pine were symbols that confirmed the basin's significance. Native American pictographs, weathered but still visible, told stories of vision quests and spiritual journeys. This was sacred ground, a place where earth and sky came together in perfect harmony. The panther led him to the center of the meadow before stopping beside the stream. She turned to face him, her golden eyes holding depths of meaning that transcended the barrier between species. For a moment, neither moved. Predator and human united in recognition of the profound beauty that surrounded them. Then the panther did something that shattered Jonah's understanding of animal behavior. She approached him slowly, deliberately, until she stood close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her massive frame. With exquisite gentleness, she pressed her great head against his chest, a gesture so human-like in its emotional content that tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. The contact lasted only seconds before she pulled away, but the message was unmistakable. She trusted him completely, placing her faith in a man she barely knew because desperation had stripped away all other options. In that moment of connection, Jonah felt barriers he'd built around his heart begin to crumble like sandcastles before the tide. "I understand," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you need, I'll help if I can." The panther's response was to turn toward the far end of the basin, where the granite walls came together in a narrow cleft barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. Hidden in shadow, the opening was nearly invisible from any distance, camouflaged by fallen rocks and hanging vegetation. Only someone standing directly in front of it would recognize the passage for what it was, a doorway into the mountain's secret heart. As they approached the cleft, Jonah became aware of sounds that didn't belong in the wilderness silence. Faint, mewling cries, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine boughs, echoed from somewhere beyond the narrow opening. The sounds were unmistakably feline, the distressed calls of young animals in need. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. The panther was a mother, and her cubs were hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of caves that honeycombed the mountain's interior. Something had happened to threaten their safety, driving her to the desperate measure of seeking human assistance. The narrow passage led into a natural corridor carved by millennia of water flow. Smooth granite walls rose on both sides, creating a tunnel that twisted and turned as it penetrated deeper into the mountain. The panther moved through the passage with the confidence of long familiarity, but Jonah had to feel his way carefully in the dim light that filtered down from above. The cries grew stronger as they progressed, taking on the urgent quality of young animals in distress. The panther's pace quickened despite the treacherous footing, her maternal instincts overriding all other considerations. Whatever crisis had driven her to seek Jonah's help was reaching a critical point. The passage opened into a circular chamber, lit by shafts of sunlight that penetrated cracks in the granite ceiling. The space felt like a natural cathedral, its walls carved smooth by ancient waters and decorated with mineral deposits that gleamed like jewels in the filtered light. But Jonah's attention was immediately drawn to the far end of the chamber, where a narrow ledge led to a deeper cave system. The panther bounded across the chamber with desperate grace, disappearing into the shadows beyond the ledge. Her anguished roar echoed off the granite walls, a sound that spoke of grief and fury and desperate love. In that cry, Jonah heard the voice of every parent who had ever faced the potential loss of their child. As he made his way carefully across the chamber floor, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The panther hadn't been following him out of curiosity or predatory interest. She'd been evaluating him, testing his character, determining whether he possessed the compassion and courage necessary to help her save what mattered most in the world. The sounds coming from the cave beyond the ledge painted a picture that made his heart race with anticipation and dread. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the answer to the mystery that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. More importantly, somewhere ahead lay creatures whose lives depended on his willingness to risk everything for beings he'd never seen. As Jonah began the careful climb toward the ledge, his father's compass steady in his palm, he felt purpose flooding through him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time in 3 years, he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what mattered most. The Panther's cubs were waiting, and their mother had chosen him to be their salvation. The tattered photograph had survived 3 years in Jonah's wallet, its edges worn soft from countless nervous handlings during the darkest moments of his exile. As he carefully climbed toward the cave entrance where the Panther had disappeared, the image of his family seemed to burn against his chest like a talisman. Sarah's gentle smile, Emma's gap-toothed grin, and his own younger face filled with hope and love, all captured in a moment of perfect happiness that felt like a lifetime ago. The ledge proved wider than it had appeared from below, carved from solid granite and worn smooth by centuries of use. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls here too, images of great cats and human figures that suggested this sacred space had sheltered partnerships between species for generations beyond counting. The native peoples who had once called these mountains home had understood something that modern civilization had forgotten, that wilderness and humanity were meant to coexist, not merely endure each other. The cave entrance yawned before him, like an open mouth, its depths shrouded in shadows that seemed to swallow light. From within came the sound that had drawn them here, the distressed mewing of young animals in crisis. But now Jonah could hear something else, a low rumbling that spoke of the mother panther's anguish as she faced a situation beyond her power to resolve. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, the scene before him became clear with heartbreaking clarity. The panther crouched over 2 small forms in a natural depression at the back of the cave. Her massive body curved protectively around cubs that couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. They were beautiful despite their obvious distress, perfect miniatures of their mother with the same sleek black coat and golden eyes that had captivated Jonah from their first meeting. But something was terribly wrong. The cubs lay listless against their mother's warm flank, their breathing shallow and rapid. Their eyes, which should have been bright with curiosity and mischief, were dull with fever. One cub, slightly smaller than its sibling, made weak attempts to nurse while the other barely moved at all. The mother panther looked up at Jonah's approach, her eyes holding depths of desperation that transcended species barriers. In her gaze, he saw every parent's worst nightmare, the helpless terror of watching your children suffer while being powerless to ease their pain. It was an expression he recognized from his own mirror during Emma's brief battle with pneumonia when she was 5, and from Sarah's face during her darkest struggles with depression. "Oh, Mama," Jonah whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "They're so sick." The panther's response was to gently nudge the weaker cub toward him, a gesture of such profound trust that it left him breathless. Here was a wild predator, one of nature's most dangerous hunters, offering her most precious possessions to a human stranger because she recognized that her own strength wasn't enough to save them. Jonah approached slowly, allowing the panther to grow comfortable with his presence before kneeling beside the cubs. Up close, their condition was even more alarming. Both babies showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition, their skin loose over prominent ribs. The smaller cub's breathing was labored, suggesting respiratory infection or worse. As he examined them with the gentle touch he'd once used to comfort Emma during her childhood illnesses, memories flooded through him unbidden. Sarah reading stories while he held their feverish daughter through long nights of worry. The relief when Emma's fever finally broke, her first smile after days of listless suffering. The way Sarah had cried with joy when the doctor pronounced their little girl completely recovered. But other memories came, two darker ones that he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. The call that had shattered his world, the frantic drive home through mountain passes that seemed to stretch forever, the smoldering ruins where his life had once stood solid and secure, the terrible silence that had followed, broken only by his own anguished screams when reality finally penetrated his shock. The Panther seemed to sense his emotional turmoil, pressing her great head against his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that bridged the gap between species. Her touch anchored him in the present moment, reminding him that these cubs needed his help now, not his grief over failures he couldn't change. "I don't know if I can save them," he told her honestly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not a veterinarian. I don't have the right medicine or equipment." The Panther's response was to fix him with a stare of such intensity that he felt it in his bones. Her golden eyes seemed to say that his knowledge of medicine was less important than his willingness to try, that sometimes love and determination mattered more than expertise. The smaller cub chose that moment to open his eyes and look directly at Jonah, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Those golden orbs held the same trust and innocence that had once shone from Emma's face when she'd looked to her father to make everything better. The same faith that he'd failed to justify on the night when it mattered most. Tears spilled down Jonah's weathered cheeks as 3 years of carefully controlled grief came pouring out. He wept for his daughter's cut-short life, for Sarah's struggles, with depression that he'd been too proud or too busy to fully understand, for the countless moments of connection he'd taken for granted until they were gone forever. But he also wept for the cubs lying helpless before him, for their mother's desperate faith in his ability to help, for the possibility of redemption that lay curled in his trembling hands. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to the Panther, his voice broken with anguish. "My own family needed me, and I wasn't there. I was here in these same mountains, thinking about hunting and my own selfish wants while they died alone." The Panther's response was to gently take his wrist in her powerful jaws, not biting but holding, her touch as gentle as a mother's caress. Her message was clear. The past couldn't be changed, but the present moment offered its own opportunities for love and sacrifice. As if responding to their mother's wordless communication, both cubs stirred slightly, their small voices joining in weak cries that tugged at something deep in Jonah's chest. They were so young, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on the adults in their world to keep them safe. Like Emma had been on that final night, trusting that her parents would protect her from every harm. But this time was different. This time, he was here. This time, he could choose love over isolation, action over paralysis, hope over the bitter comfort of self-recrimination. "All right," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength as purpose flooded through him. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try. I'll do everything I can to help them." The Panther released his wrist and stepped back, her entire posture expressing gratitude and renewed hope. She began to pace restlessly around the cave, clearly torn between staying with her cubs and the need to seek additional help. Her behavior suggested that she understood the seriousness of their condition better than Jonah had initially realized. As he studied the cubs more carefully, Jonah began to piece together what might have happened. The cave showed signs of recent disturbance, scattered debris, claw marks on the walls, and the faint but unmistakable scent of human presence. Someone had been here, someone who had posed enough of a threat to drive the Panther family from their original den into this emergency shelter. The implications were chilling. These mountains had remained largely pristine because of their remote location and protected status. But that protection was only as strong as the people charged with enforcing it. If poachers or illegal hunters had penetrated this deep into the wilderness, They represented a threat not just to individual animals, but to the entire ecosystem. More importantly, if humans had caused this crisis through their actions or presence, then perhaps humans could also provide the solution. The cubs needed medical attention beyond anything Jonah could provide in a mountain cave. But there were wildlife rehabilitation centers in the valley below, facilities equipped to handle exactly this kind of emergency. The challenge would be getting 2 sick cubs and their mother down treacherous mountain terrain to where help waited. It would require trust, courage, and a willingness to risk everything for creatures that owed him nothing and could offer nothing in return except the chance to make amends for his past failures. As if reading his thoughts, the smaller cub lifted his head and looked directly into Jonah's eyes. In that gaze was the same trust Emma had always shown her father, the absolute faith that the adults in her world would move mountains to keep her safe. This time, Jonah thought, as he gathered the fragile creature against his chest, this time he wouldn't let that trust be misplaced. Whatever it took, however dangerous the journey ahead, he would find a way to save these innocent lives that had been placed in his care. The panther watched his decision form with ancient wisdom in her golden eyes, understanding that some promises were too important to break twice. The small pink hair ribbon lay half buried in the soft earth near the cave entrance. Its bright color a jarring contrast against the natural browns and grays of the mountain environment. Jonah almost missed it entirely, focused as he was on examining the cubs and planning their rescue. But something about the artificial cheerfulness of that pink fabric caught his eye, and when he knelt to examine it more closely, his blood ran cold. The ribbon was no more than a few months old based on its condition. More importantly, it was exactly the kind of hair accessory that little girls wore, the sort of simple decoration that transformed ordinary ponytails into something special. Emma had owned dozens of similar ribbons, scattered across her dresser like colorful confetti, each one representing a different mood or outfit or special occasion. Jonah's hands trembled as he lifted the ribbon from the earth, and the panther's reaction confirmed his worst fears. She approached the small piece of fabric with obvious recognition, sniffing it carefully before looking up at him with eyes that held depths of ancient sorrow. This wasn't the first time she'd seen this ribbon. Somehow, somewhere, their paths had crossed before. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The panther hadn't chosen him randomly. She hadn't followed him through the wilderness because of some mystical connection or animal instinct. She'd sought him out because she recognized something in him, the scent of grief, perhaps, or the unmistakable markers of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. Where did this come from? He whispered, though he suspected he already knew. The answer. The panther's response was to move deeper into the cave, leading him past the spot where her cubs lay to a narrow alcove he hadn't noticed before. Here, protected from the elements and carefully arranged, was a collection of items that told a story more heartbreaking than anything Jonah could have imagined. A child's backpack, bright purple with cartoon characters. A water bottle with stickers peeling from its surface. A small hiking boot size 3, its mate nowhere to be found, and scattered throughout the collection. More personal items. A friendship bracelet woven from colorful thread. A small stuffed animal worn soft with love, and a family photograph sealed in a plastic bag. Jonah's hands shook as he examined the photograph. It showed a family of 4 posed before a camping tent, their faces bright with vacation happiness. The parents looked to be in their 30s, outdoor enthusiasts based on their gear and sun-weathered appearance. Between them stood 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 7. Her blonde hair held back by the same pink ribbon now clutched in Jonah's trembling fingers. The girl's smile was radiant, full of the fearless joy that belonged to children who believed absolutely in their parents' ability to keep them safe. She looked so much like Emma at that age that Jonah felt his heart crack open all over again. Different coloring, Different features, but the same innocent trust. The same assumption that tomorrow would bring new adventures and endless possibilities. Understanding dawned with horrible clarity. These weren't random objects cached by a nun, animal with hoarding instincts. They were memorial items, carefully preserved by a creature who tried to save a lost child and failed. The Panther had encountered this family somewhere in the wilderness, had witnessed some tragedy that left a little girl separated from her parents, and had done everything in her power to help. But even the most intelligent and compassionate animal couldn't navigate human bureaucracy or communicate complex information to search and rescue teams. The Panther could guard and protect, could even guide, but she couldn't bridge the gap between the wild world and human civilization. The child had died despite her efforts, and the guilt of that failure had marked the Panther as deeply as his own failures had scarred Jonah. "You tried to save her," he said aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "You found her lost and scared, and you tried to help." The Panther's response was a low rumble of grief that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She approached the collection of items and gently nuzzled the small stuffed animal. Her massive frame curled around the tiny token with exquisite tenderness. In that gesture, Jonah saw his own midnight visits to Emma's preserved bedroom. The way he'd held her favorite books and toys while drowning in guilt and sorrow. But there was more to the story, and the Panther's behavior suggested layers of meaning that Jonah was only beginning to understand. She'd brought him here not just to see her cubs, but to show him this shrine to another child's memory. The connection wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, purposeful, designed to communicate something vital about their shared burden of grief. As he studied the collection more carefully, Jonah began to piece together what must have happened. A family camping trip gone wrong, a child wandering away from the campsite, perhaps during a storm or in the confusion of a medical emergency. The Panther had found the lost girl and tried to lead her to safety, but without human intervention, even the most heroic animal efforts would ultimately fail. The rangers, reports he'd read during his years as a teacher, came flooding backstories of children lost in the wilderness, of desperate search efforts that sometimes ended in tragedy despite everyone's best intentions. The mountains were beautiful but unforgiving, especially to young ones who lacked the experience to survive extreme conditions. But the Panther's guilt over failing to save one child had transformed into desperate determination to save others, her own cubs. She'd recognized in Jonah someone who understood the weight of parental failure, someone who might possess both the motivation and the means to succeed where she'd fallen short. The smaller cub's weak cry from the main chamber pulled Jonah back to the present crisis. Whatever had happened to the lost child was a tragedy that couldn't be undone, but these cubs still had a chance if he acted quickly enough. The Panther had placed her faith in him based on their shared experience of loss, trusting that his human guilt might drive him to the extraordinary efforts her babies would need to survive. "I understand now," he told her quietly, carefully replacing the photograph in its protective bag. "You chose me because you knew I'd never give up, because I have my own ghost to face." The Panther's golden eyes seemed to hold infinite sadness and desperate hope in equal measure. She'd shown him her deepest secret, revealed the source of her own devastating grief, and trusted him to understand that some failures cut so deep they could only be healed by preventing others as they returned. To the cubs, Jonah felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about saving two sick animals. It was about redemption for both himself and the remarkable creature who'd sought him out. The Panther had failed to save one child, but refused to fail again. Now it was his turn to prove that love and determination could sometimes triumph over impossible odds. The lost girl with the pink ribbon would never grow up to have adventures of her own. But perhaps these cubs could live to have families of their own. Perhaps in saving them, both he and the Panther could find a way to forgive themselves for the times when their best efforts hadn't been enough. The thought filled him with purpose more powerful than any he'd felt since before the fire. These cubs would live. Whatever it took, however dangerous the journey ahead, he would make sure their mother's faith wasn't misplaced again. Some promises he'd learned were too important to break twice. The emergency medical kit had seemed adequate when Jonah packed it that morning, but now its limitations became starkly apparent as he knelt beside two dying cubs in a mountain cave. Basic bandages, antiseptic wipes, pain relievers meant for humans. None of it designed for the specialized needs of infant predators, whose lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Yet he forced himself to work methodically, drawing on every scrap of knowledge gained from years of childhood pets, veterinary visits with Emma's hamsters and goldfish, and the wilderness first aid course he'd taken during his teaching years. The cubs needed hydration most urgently. Their small bodies were dangerously dehydrated from fever, and their inability to nurse properly. Using his cleanest bandana and water from his purified supply, Jonah created makeshift feeding apparatus that would allow him to get liquid into the cubs without drowning them. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring him to dribble tiny amounts of water onto their tongues while supporting their weakened bodies. But gradually, incrementally, both cubs began to respond, their eyes growing slightly brighter as life-giving. Moisture reached parched tissues. The mother panther watched every movement with fierce attention, her golden eyes tracking each gesture as if memorizing techniques she might need to replicate later. Her intelligence was remarkable. She seemed to understand that Jonah's gentle manipulations were helping rather than harming her babies, and she positioned herself to assist rather than interfere. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden of another time, another place, when he'd fought to save a child's life. Emma at age 5, burning with fever from pneumonia that had developed so rapidly it caught them completely off guard. He remembered the terror of that midnight rush to the emergency room, Sarah crying in the passenger seat while Emma lay limp in her arms. The endless hours in the waiting room, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, bargaining with fate for his daughter's life. They'd won that battle. Emma had recovered completely, her natural resilience overcoming the infection with help from modern medicine and the skilled care of pediatric specialists. She'd been home within a week, bouncing around the house as if nothing had happened, already planning her next adventure while her parents still shook with residual fear. But this time, there were no specialists, no modern medicine, no emergency room waiting just minutes away. There was only one man with basic supplies and a desperate need to prove that love could sometimes substitute for expertise. The larger cub showed the first signs of real improvement, lifting his head to look around the cave with something approaching curiosity. His breathing had eased, and when Jonah offered a finger to sniff, the little predator responded with a tentative lick that felt like rough sandpaper against his skin. The gesture was so reminiscent of Emma's kitten, the tiny orange tabby she'd loved for 3 short months before leukemia claimed it, that Jonah had to blink back tears. But the smaller cub remained worryingly weak, his breathing shallow and labored despite Jonah's efforts. This little one would need professional veterinary care if he was going to survive, and that meant somehow getting him down the mountain to the wildlife rehabilitation center in Pine Ridge Valley. The logistics seemed impossible. The journey would take hours over treacherous terrain, and the cub was far too weak to survive such an ordeal without constant care. Worse, the weather was deteriorating. Clouds had been building all afternoon, and the wind carried the smell of approaching snow. A storm in these mountains could trap them for days, and the cubs simply didn't have that much time. "We need to go now," Jonah told the panther, his voice tight with urgency. "Tonight, before the weather gets worse. If we wait until morning, it might be too late." The panther's response was immediate and decisive. She rose from her position beside the cubs and padded to the cave entrance, testing the air with her sensitive nose. Her body language conveyed the same urgency. Jonah felt time was running out, and action was needed regardless of the risks involved. But as Jonah began fashioning a carrying sling from his spare clothing, a new realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The panther couldn't accompany them down the mountain. Her presence near human habitation would trigger every protective instinct in the region. Wildlife officers, hunters, frightened citizens convinced that a dangerous predator threatened their safety. She would be shot on sight, her maternal devotion mistaken for aggression. The thought of separating mother from cubs felt like another form of cruelty, but the alternative was worse. If the panther accompanied them, all three cats would likely die, the cubs from their illness, and their mother from human fear and misunderstanding. "You can't come with us," he said gently, and the panther's reaction confirmed that she understood. Her great head dropped, and a sound escaped her throat that could only be described as a sob. She knew what he was asking, that she trusted him completely with the most precious things in her world, that she let them go without knowing if she'd ever see them again. The parallel to his own life was devastating in its clarity. He'd failed to be there when Sarah and Emma needed him most, had prioritized his own desires over their safety. Now, he was asking the panther to make the opposite choice, to sacrifice her own instincts and needs for the slim chance that her cubs might survive. Dodd, as if sensing his internal struggle, the panther approached and gently pressed her massive head against his chest. The gesture conveyed forgiveness, understanding, and a trust so complete it took his breath away. She was choosing to believe in his ability to save what she couldn't, placing faith in a broken man who'd spent 3 years believing himself unworthy of anyone's confidence. The moment was interrupted by a weak cry from the smaller cub, a sound that galvanized both adults into action. Time for reflection had passed. Now only swift action could prevent tragedy from claiming another innocent life. Working together with the efficiency born of shared purpose, Jonah and the panther prepared for the most dangerous journey of their lives. The cubs were carefully wrapped in Jonah's spare clothing, insulated against the cold, and secured in a makeshift carrier fashioned from his backpack. Emergency supplies were redistributed to accommodate the precious cargo, and his route down the mountain was planned with the obsessive care of a military operation. The panther would escort them to the edge of her territory, then wait for their return. It was the only plan that offered hope of success, despite the heart-wrenching separation it required. Dodd, as they prepared to leave the cave that had sheltered her family. The panther performed one final act that nearly broke Jonah's composure entirely. She gathered each cub in her powerful jaws with exquisite gentleness, covering them with loving licks and purrs that spoke of maternal devotion beyond words. She was saying goodbye, uncertain if she'd ever see them again, but willing to sacrifice everything for their chance at life. The smaller cubs seemed to rally slightly at his mother's touch, as if drawing strength from her presence for the ordeal ahead. His eyes opened briefly, fixing on Jonah's face with the same trust his mother had shown, accepting this strange human as part of his pack. "I won't let you down," Jonah whispered to both mother and cubs, the words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "I swear on my daughter's memory, I won't fail them." The panther's golden eyes seemed to acknowledge his promise, and in them Jonah saw reflected his own desperate hope that love might prove stronger than circumstance, that sometimes broken people could still accomplish extraordinary things. When the stakes were high enough, Dodd, as they began the treacherous descent through mountain passes that grew more dangerous with each passing hour, Jonah carried more than just 2 sick cubs toward an uncertain salvation. He carried the hopes of a mother who trusted him with everything that mattered, the memory of his own failures that demanded redemption, and the fragile possibility that healing might finally be within reach for all of them. The storm was coming. Time was running out. And 2 tiny lives depended on his ability to become the man he'd once believed himself to be before fire. And loss had taught him that good intentions weren't always enough to prevent tragedy. This time, They would have to be. The rope and harness had saved Jonah's life more than once during his years in the mountains, but tonight they would serve a different purpose entirely. As he rigged the climbing system that would allow him to navigate the treacherous cliff face with 2 dying cubs strapped to his chest, every knot carried the weight of lives that couldn't be lost to a moment's carelessness. The storm had arrived, with typical mountain fury, transforming the descent into a nightmare of wind-driven snow and ice-slicked rock faces. What should have been a difficult but manageable 4-hour hike had become a technical climbing expedition requiring every skill Jonah had learned during his brief military service and subsequent years in the wilderness. The cubs were secured in the modified carrier against his chest, their small bodies wrapped in every spare piece of clothing he possessed. Their breathing came in rapid, shallow pants that spoke of systems failing despite his earlier efforts. The smaller cub had barely moved in the past hour, his tiny form so still that Jonah found himself constantly checking for signs of life. "Stay with me, little ones," he whispered, his words snatched away by wind that howled through the mountain passes like a living thing. "Your mama is counting on us." The Panther had accompanied them as far as the cliff face, her powerful form moving through the storm with supernatural grace. But here, at the boundary between the wild world and human civilization, she'd been forced to stop. The anguish in her golden eyes as she watched Jonah begin his descent would haunt him forever, a mother's helpless terror as her children disappeared into danger she couldn't share. The first 100 feet of the descent went smoothly, muscle memory and careful preparation combining to keep them moving steadily downward despite the deteriorating conditions. But as they reached the section where the rock face angled outward, forming an overhang that required precise technique to navigate safely, disaster struck with stunning suddenness. A section of rock that had appeared solid gave way under Jonah's weight, sending chunks of granite spinning into the darkness below. The sudden shift in his anchor point swung him violently against the cliff face, and only years of experience kept him from losing his grip entirely. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent spikes of pain through his ribs. But worse was the weak cry from one of the cubs, a sound that spoke of distress beyond their already critical condition hanging suspended in the storm, with nowhere to go but down. Jonah forced himself to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. The cliff face below showed no obvious route that would support their combined weight, and returning to the top was impossible given the cub's deteriorating condition. Forward was the only option, regardless of the risks involved. Using techniques learned from military rappelling exercises, Jonah began a controlled fall down the cliff face, using his feet and free hand to guide their descent while the rope system absorbed the shock of rapid movement. It was dangerous beyond measure one. Miscalculation would send all 3 of them plummeting to their deaths, but the cubs were running out of time for anything resembling safety. The world became a blur of wind, snow, and granite rushing past in the darkness. Jonah's headlamp provided a narrow cone of visibility that showed glimpses of handholds and ledges, but the storm made depth perception nearly impossible. He was navigating by instinct and prayer, trusting his equipment and experience to keep them alive for the precious minutes needed to reach more manageable terrain. 50 feet from the bottom of the cliff face, the smaller cub stopped breathing entirely. Jonah felt the tiny body go completely limp against his chest, and terror gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The final section of the descent passed in a controlled fall that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. But desperation had redefined the boundaries of acceptable risk. The moment his feet touched level ground, Jonah was working frantically to revive the unresponsive cub. Using techniques half-remembered from childhood pet emergencies and wilderness first aid courses, he performed gentle compressions on the tiny chest while clearing the cub's airway with his finger. The small body was so fragile that he feared causing more damage. but death was the only alternative to action. "Come on," he pleaded, his voice breaking with emotion. "Don't give up now. Your mama needs you to fight." For long seconds that felt like hours, nothing happened. The cub remained limp and unresponsive, while his siblings' cries grew weaker in the modified carrier. The storm raged around them, and Jonah found himself screaming at the darkness, raging against a universe that seemed determined to take everything he tried to protect. Then, with a cough so faint it was barely audible above the wind, the smaller cub drew a shuddering breath. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused but undeniably alive, and Jonah felt tears of relief freeze on his cheeks. The little fighter was still with them, still clinging to life with the tenacity that had sustained his species for millions of years. But they were still miles from help, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The valley floor stretched ahead like a white void, broken only by the dark shapes of trees that offered dubious shelter. Somewhere beyond that wilderness lay the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center and the veterinary expertise that represented the cubs' only hope for survival. Jonah adjusted the carrier to ensure both cubs were as warm and secure as possible. Then began the grinding march across terrain that grew more treacherous with each passing hour. Snow had covered familiar landmarks, and the wind made navigation by compass nearly impossible. He was traveling by dead reckoning now, following valley floors and creek beds that should eventually lead him to the main road. The larger cub had rallied slightly during the descent, his natural resilience responding to the warming effect of being pressed against Jonah's body heat. But his brother remained frighteningly weak, breathing in irregular gasps that suggested internal systems pushed far beyond their limits as they struggled through snow that grew deeper with each mile. Jonah found himself talking to the cubs in the same gentle voice he'd once used to comfort Emma during her childhood fears. He told them about their mother's courage, about the beautiful mountain basin where they'd been born, about the adventures that awaited them if they could just hold on a little longer. But mostly he made promises to their mother, to himself, and to the memory of his own lost family. He would not fail again. He would not allow death to claim innocent lives while he stood helpless. Whatever it took, however much it cost him personally, these cubs would live to grow strong and wild and free. The cell phone had been dead weight in Jonah's pack for 3 years, its battery long since drained and its circuits probably corroded from mountain humidity. But as he crested the final ridge before Pine Ridge Valley, desperation drove him to power it on for the first time since the night he'd fled civilization in his grief. To his amazement, the device flickered to life, showing a single bar of signal strength and enough battery power for perhaps one call. The sight of those glowing icons felt like a miracle in the storm-lashed darkness, a technological lifeline thrown across the void between wilderness and salvation. His numb fingers could barely work the touchscreen as he scrolled through contacts he'd thought permanently lost. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the veterinarian who treated Emma's various pets over the years, appeared in the directory like an answered prayer. If anyone would take an emergency call from a ghost, if anyone would believe his impossible story, it would be the woman who'd shared his daughter's tears over every sick hamster and injured bird. The call connected on the third ring, and Sarah's familiar voice cut through the storm static with professional clarity. Dr. Martinez, Pine Ridge Animal Hospital. "Sarah, it's Jonah Gage," he gasped, his words nearly stolen by the wind. "I need help. Emergency." The pause that followed contained 3 years of unspoken history, his disappearance after the funeral, her unsuccessful attempts to reach out, the grief-stricken silence that had swallowed one of her daughter's favorite teachers. "Jonah, my God, where have you been? Are you hurt?" "I'm in the mountains above Pine Ridge with 2 dying panther cubs. They need veterinary care immediately or they're going to die." Another pause, longer this time, as professional skepticism warred with personal concern. "Panther cubs?" Jonah, there haven't been confirmed panthers in this region for decades. There's no time to explain, he said urgently, watching his battery indicator drop toward 0. I'm bringing them to your clinic. Have emergency supplies ready for fluids, antibiotics, whatever you'd use for severe dehydration and respiratory infection in large cats. Jonah, listen to me carefully. Even if what you're saying is true, I can't treat wild predators without proper permits, and they're going to die, Jonah interrupted, his voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation. Please, Sarah, for Emma's sake, for all the animals she loved, please don't let them die because of paperwork. The silence stretched across the connection, filled only by static and the howling wind. Then Sarah's voice returned, professional, mask replaced by the compassion that had made her Emma's favorite adult outside the family. Where are you exactly? 2 miles north of town, coming down Fletcher Creek Trail. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I'll be ready, she said simply, and the line went dead as his battery finally gave out. The final descent into Pine Ridge passed in a blur of snow-covered streets and familiar landmarks transformed by the storm. Houses that had once been part of Jonah's daily world stood like strangers behind curtains of wind-driven snow, their warm lights speaking of lives that had continued without him, of a community that had moved on from his tragedy. The animal hospital, set on the town's outskirts, its emergency entrance blazing with light against the storm. As Jonah stumbled through the glass doors, Sarah materialized from the back rooms with the efficiency that had always marked her practice. She'd aged in the 3 years since he'd seen her stress lines around her eyes, gray threading through her dark hair, but her gentle competence remained unchanged. Dear God, she whispered, taking in his frost-covered appearance and the precious cargo strapped to his chest. What have you been through? Later, Jonah managed through chattering teeth. The cubs come first. Working together with the seamless coordination they developed during Emma's pet emergencies, they transferred the cubs to heated examination tables and began the desperate fight for their lives. Sarah's initial skepticism vanished the moment she saw the magnificent creatures Jonah had carried through the storm. These were indeed panther cubs, probably the first seen in the region for generations. Both cubs were hypothermic and severely dehydrated, their small bodies pushed to the absolute limits of survival. But they were also fighters, responding to warm fluids and gentle handling with a resilience that spoke to their wild heritage. The larger cub in particular seemed to rally once warm blood began circulating properly through his system. The smaller cub remained critical, his breathing labored and his responses minimal. Sarah worked over him with the intense focus she brought to every life-threatening case, administering medications and monitoring vital signs with equipment designed for domestic animals but adaptable to exotic patients. He's very weak, she said quietly, her hands never stopping their gentle ministrations. Internal temperature is dangerously low, and there are signs of pneumonia, but his heart is strong. As if responding to her words, the little cub's eyes opened, focusing briefly on Jonah's face before drifting closed again. That moment of connection, of recognition and trust, filled Jonah with hope more powerful than anything he'd felt in years. His mother, he said suddenly, realization hitting him like a physical blow. She's still up there in the storm, waiting. She doesn't know if they're alive. Sarah looked up from her patient, understanding immediately. You have to go back to her. I can't leave them. What if they're stable for now? Sarah interrupted gently. And that mother has been in agony for hours, not knowing if her baby survived. She needs to know they're safe. The truth of her words was undeniable, but the thought of leaving the cubs felt like abandoning them all over again. Sarah seemed to read his internal struggle with the insight she'd always shown into wounded hearts. I'll guard them with my life, she promised. They're Emma's legacy now, as much as yours. I won't let anything happen to them. As Jonah prepared to return to the mountains, and the panther who waited in desperate hope, Tears of gratitude and relief finally came. The cubs would live. Professional care and modern medicine would complete what love and determination had begun. For the first time in 3 years, he'd succeeded in saving what mattered most. The journey back to their mother would be the final chapter in a story of redemption that had begun with mutual recognition of grief and was ending with the promise of renewed life. The new wooden carving took shape under Jonah's patient hands as dawn broke over the mountain basin, its golden light transforming the frost-covered meadow into a cathedral of crystalline beauty. The piece of mountain maple, seasoned by 2 winters in his cabin, revealed its grains slowly as his knife peeled away thin shavings that curled and fell like prayers made manifest. 3 months had passed since that desperate night, when he'd carried 2 dying cubs through a blizzard to salvation. 3 months of daily visits to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, of watching tiny predators grow strong and healthy under Sarah's expert care, of building trust with a mother panther who'd learned that some humans could be allies rather than threats. The carving depicted all 3 cats, the mother in protective stance over her cubs, who were rendered in playful detail that captured their growing confidence and wild joy. It was Jonah's finest work, every line and curve infused with love and gratitude for creatures who taught him that broken hearts could heal if given purpose greater than their own pain. The Panther family had returned to their mountain sanctuary 2 weeks ago, the cubs strong enough to survive in the wild, but still young enough to learn their mothers essential lessons about hunting and territory and the eternal vigilance required of apex predators. Jonah visited them regularly now, his presence accepted as part of their extended pack, a strange but trusted figure who brought occasional treats and served as a bridge between their world and the human civilization below. Today's visit carried special significance. Sarah would be joining him for the first time, her initial terror of wild predators gradually replaced by professional fascination and personal investment in their welfare. She'd become their unofficial advocate in the valley below, establishing protocols for their protection and educating local authorities about the treasure they harbored in their mountains. As Jonah put the finishing touches on the carving, adding the delicate whiskers that would bring the panther mother's face to life, he heard familiar sounds from the forest's edge. The cubs approached first, as they always did now, bold and curious about his activities, secure in their mother's acceptance of his presence. They'd grown enormously in 3 months, their baby fat replaced by the lean muscle of natural predators. But they still possessed the playful nature that marked all young things. Learning about their world, the mother panther emerged from the shadows with her characteristic grace, moving across the meadow like liquid night given form. Her golden eyes held depths of recognition and gratitude that transcended species barriers, acknowledging the bond forged through shared crisis and mutual salvation. She was magnificent in her wild health, every inch the apex predator nature had designed her to be. "Good morning, beautiful," Jonah said softly, as had become his custom during these visits. "Your babies are looking strong today." The larger cub, now nearly adult-sized but still bearing traces of juvenile spotted markings, approached boldly and bumped against Jonah's knee in greeting. His brother, once so close to death that night in the storm, hung back with typical caution, but watched with bright intelligence that spoke of a sharp mind and a healthy body. Sarah's arrival was announced by the crack of a branch under her hiking boots, and all 3 cats immediately focused their attention on the newcomer. But there was no alarm in their posture. Jonah's scent and body language communicated acceptance, and wild animals possessed an uncanny ability to read emotional undercurrents that humans often missed. "They're incredible," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with professional awe and personal wonder. "I've been treating animals for 20 years, but seeing them in their natural environment, it's like witnessing magic." The panther mother studied Sarah with careful attention, testing air currents with her sensitive nose, and reading body language with the expertise of a creature whose survival depended on accurate assessment of potential threats. Whatever she sensed must have satisfied her, because she settled onto her haunches and allowed her cubs to continue their exploration of the human visitor's dot as the morning progressed. Jonah shared the story behind each element of the carving, explaining how specific details captured moments from their shared journey. The protective curve of the mother's body reflected her desperate vigil during that terrible night. The playful positioning of the cubs honored their resilience and joy in simply being alive. The mountain backdrop showed the sacred basin where their story had begun. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, examining the finished piece with an artist's appreciation for skilled craftsmanship. "But what will you do with it?" Jonah smiled, the expression feeling natural on his face for the first time in years. "It belongs here, with them. Some things are too precious to possess. They can only be honored." As if understanding his words, the panther mother rose and approached the carving, sniffing it carefully before fixing Jonah with a stare of such intensity that it seemed to peer directly into his soul. In her golden eyes, he saw acceptance, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like forgiveness, both given and received. The moment was interrupted by movement from the cubs, who discovered Sarah's backpack and were investigating it with typical feline curiosity. Their antics drew laughter from both humans, and even their mother seemed to relax in the face of such innocent mischief. "They've given me my life back," Jonah said quietly, watching the cubs play with the wonder of someone seeing the world through new eyes. "When I lost Emma and Sarah, I thought my purpose died with them. But these three taught me that love doesn't end with loss. It just finds new forms." Sarah's hand found his shoulder, offering comfort and understanding without need for words. She'd known his family, had shared their joys and sorrows through the medium of beloved pets, and understood the depth of transformation he'd undergone in these mountains. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the basin, signaling time for the humans to begin their return journey, Jonah placed the finished carving on a flat boulder where it would catch both morning and evening light. The mountain weather would season it, the elements would add their own artistry to his work, and the Panther family would have a permanent reminder of the bond that had saved them all. The mother panther approached the carving one final time, touching her great head to the wooden representation of her family with exquisite gentleness. Then she looked at Jonah, her expression conveying gratitude beyond words before she turned and padded toward the forest, her cubs bounding after her with the confident joy of young predators, secure in their mother's protection. As he and Sarah began the long hike back to civilization, Jonah felt the weight of 3 years' grief finally lifting from his shoulders. He would always carry Sarah and Emma in his heart, would always regret his absence during their final hours, but guilt no longer defined him.